Video. Okay, so I'd like to wish you all good morning. We will start with the Vajradhara lineage prayer, the Vajradhara prayer. So this morning, we'll recite them, as I said last night. Did I say it this way? Whichever way I said last night, I'm going to say it differently today, I'm sure. We will do the prayers in English today. So we'll start with the Vajradhara lineage prayer. I guess I have to share my screen. Here we are. Oh, great, great Vajra Vidya three times karma and lineage holders of the elder four and younger grade, the Tigan tongues of the glorious truth, and so forth. Protectors of all beings, the unequal and master of the profound path Mahamudra. Kaju Guru Sid, my prayer your lineage I uphold. Please bless me so I may adopt your ways of liberation. Just as revulsions taught to be the legs of meditation, this meditator does not cling to any food or wealth, and severs all the ties that bind me to this present life. Please bless me to be unattached to one or to gain. Just as devotion's taught to be the head of meditation, continually this meditator supplicates the Guru, who opens on the doorway to the truth of his instructions. Please bless me so that uncontrived devotion may well forth, as non-distractions taught to be the core of meditation. This meditator just remains not altering at all. The fresh and pristine essence of whatever thought occurs. Please bless me to be free from thinking there's a meditation. Just as it's taught the essence of all thoughts is Dharmakaya, not anything at all, and yet arising in all ways. appearing for this meditator in unceasing play. Bless me to know samsara and nirvana to. In all my future lifetimes may I never be apart from the authentic gurus and embrace the Dharma's glory. May I perfect the qualities of all the paths and levels, and may I swiftly realize the state of Vajradhara. I dedicate to enlightenment whatever slight merit I have gathered from prostrating and offering, confessing and rejoicing, requesting and from making supplications. This earth perfumed with scented water, strewn with flowers, graced with Mount Meru, the four lands, the sun and moon, I visualize to be a Buddha realm and offer so that all beings enjoy a perfectly pure realm. Please turn the wheel of Dharma of the great foundation and common vehicles according to the specific aims and intellects of sentient beings. In the Dharma Expanse Palace of Vakanishta is the essence of all Buddhas, the three times who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted gurus. Please bless me and all beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma become the path. Please bless us that the path dispel confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. So now please think to yourselves that we must bring, no matter what, all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And in order to achieve that state, we must engage in listening, contemplating, and meditating. And so please think to yourself that we are listening to the Dharma this morning for this purpose of bringing all sentient beings with whom we've had connections over many lifetimes to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And listening with this attitude of this motivation of bodhicitta, now let's, the Dharma that we are speaking about is the Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva. Now, among the Way of the Bodhisattva has 10 chapters, so we are discussing the 9th. We've discussed all the previous chapters already, so we're discussing the 9th chapter now. The 10th chapter we talked about in our first year of teachings, which is a little bit out of order in some ways, but also is kind of appropriate in another, but we don't need to go into that now. This 9th chapter has 5 main sections. There's the benefits of bodhicitta. There is there's a benefit of prajna. There is kind of a definition of prajna, which is determining what is and what is not, to being able to distinguish the relative appearances from their ultimate nature, and to see that actually they're not different. Of course, you say distinguish the two, but in other words, to see that the appearances themselves are empty and they don't have any real existence of their own, and yet they still appear to us. So they are empty and yet appearing yet empty. So there's this union of appearance and emptiness. This is the main point of the chapter. Then following that section, there is the third main section, which is the methods of meditating on emptiness. And so we are discussing the methods of meditating on emptiness. So there are 2 main parts here. There's meditating on the selflessness of the individual and meditating on the selflessness of phenomena. Now, actually, these 2 are really kind of the same when you think about it. It's a question of looking at some phenomena and seeing, is there anything real here? So to review what we mean by real, we mean something that is singular. It's something that you can identify and say, this is it. Not look at it and say, well, it has lots of parts and it's hard to tell what it is, but say, this is it. This is the one thing that it is. And then to be able to say that it's something that endures, that doesn't depend on anything else. In that sense, it's also autonomous in that it has a little bit of control, independence. It doesn't depend on causes and conditions. That's what we normally think of as being real. So when you think of, for example, yourself as a person, or as a sentient being, or you think about another being, what you are doing is you're looking at your body and your mind, and you're saying that somehow there must be a me here. Sometimes it might seem like the body is a mind. Sometimes it might seem like the body is me. Sometimes it might seem like the mind, that your mind, the various aspects of mind are me. But you are taking your, basically what we call the five aggregates, your form, feeling, conceptions, formations, and consciousness, and projecting the idea of a self onto those. Aside from those, you can't find anything. Those themselves individually, as we just spoke about last night, are not a self. But we have this idea that there is a self. So what that self is it's a projection. Now, sometimes we think of a projection as being something you're projecting outside yourself. But really, when you look at it, we're actually doing the same thing inside to ourselves as we do outside. You're looking at a collection of smaller components and then making them into a me. Just as when we look at, of course, the people on Zoom can't see it, so I'll hold this up here. When you look at this bouquet of flowers, you look at it and you say bouquet. You have this word that we use for it, but actually there are 3 flowers, and each of these flowers has like hundreds of petals. Look at them. This one only has dozens. These two must have hundreds, right? And then stems and leaves and all of those can be broken down. So we'll talk about that. That's kind of when you look at them and you say bouquet, or you say flowers, right? Or you can say a vase of flowers. And all of that, you're taking something that has smaller parts and then have the idea of it being something bigger. And there's a sense that there really is a bouquet here. Actually, you're projecting an idea of a bouquet or whatever you're projecting, and you see it. You think of it as being something real, but in actuality, there's nothing. So the bouquet of flowers, it doesn't seem like it's so important, but when you start looking at these things and thinking that they're real outside of yourself, you're actually doing the same thing as with a self. With the self, you've got your body, you've got your mind, and you project the idea of me onto that aggregate. So when we talk, like when we go through our philosophy classes, we would say that the characteristics of an individual self is a being who is projected onto the 5 aggregates, or on the basis of the 5 aggregates. You have this idea of a me, but it's just a projection. It's an idea. In other words, you're just giving a name to a collection of other things. And so it itself is not anything. And we can give ourselves all sorts of different names. We can call ourselves, in these days, when we talk about identity politics, we have even more names that we give ourselves, but they're all just names for this collection of things, constantly changing collection of things. In essence, if you look at it, there is no one thing that would be Khenpo David. There is no one thing that would be any of us. It's just a bunch of different things that come together and are constantly shifting. So in that sense, because there's no real Khenpo David or no real anyone else, then there's nothing to really worry about. There's nothing to be afraid of. So this is there's nothing that can be harmed when there is any threat. Benefiting something, doing something that you think is going to bring yourself pleasure is not going to bring any lasting pleasure because there's nothing real to be benefited. There's nothing that really benefits you. And so in this way, it's very freeing to see that there's no real individual self. So when we talk about the individual self, there's the kind of instinctive idea of a me, which is what I was just speaking about. And then there are the philosophical schools that have different projections. And generally, you can say that some project the idea of a me, or say that there is some soul that is conscious. So basically saying there's some aspect of mind, some aspect of consciousness that is a real me. That's the Sankhya school that we spoke about last night. And when we talk about these schools, most of you, of course, it may be the first time that you've heard about these schools. And it's difficult the very first time. Actually, I've been working on, for Rinpoche's cremation, we're working on publishing translations of some of his autobiographical writings. And he writes about his education, how he started out studying the way of the Bodhisattva is one of the first texts that he studied. And when they first studied, he said it was really difficult to get the Sankhya school. He had a hard time. Now, he started studying the Sankhya school when he was all of, by our counting, 15 years old, maybe 14 and a half, 15 years old, something like that. 16 by Tibetan counting, so for Rinpoche, something like 14 and a half or 15. And he had a hard time. So we look at Trungpa Rinpoche, as this great scholar who knew everything, and who you would ask him a question about the Sankhya school, he'd give you a great answer about it. Well, why is that? It's because he had a hard time at first, but he worked at it and he listened and he thought. So none of it is actually, what do we say? It's complicated at first, particularly when you have all these different names, all these different terms. Like you're saying, Sankhya itself, it's a Sanskrit word. Like, what does it mean and why are we using this word? Well, we're using this word because we translated it into English as enumerators, which some people do. No one would, actually, you wouldn't be able to have a dialogue with them because they wouldn't understand why they're called enumerators instead of Sankhya. There are still Sankhya philosophers in India. And it's a very important school. It's got a very interesting ideas. Its ideas seem complicated at first. But basically what they're saying is you've got a primal nature and you've got a self. And the self is basically experiencing through a process that they define very, very, in a very complicated way. They're experiencing the primal nature in various manifestations. So you've got a self, it's experiencing those. The self is conscious, it's singular and permanent. It's experiencing all these conscious or all these different manifestations that are actually the primal nature appearing to it in various ways. To put it in kind of a simple way, right? So you got two things: conscious self, permanent and singular. You've got the primal nature, which is also permanent, singular, and singular, except it has three parts. And each of those three parts are three parts. We won't go there today. We'll get to, well, we might later today. But each of those, it experiences things. So if the self is permanent and it's experiencing something, if it's permanent, it has to be experiencing that all the time. Otherwise, it's changing. If you are experiencing a sound and you're permanent, if that sound ceases and your experience of that sound ceases, then you're changing and therefore you're not permanent. And the experience of sound, the experience of form, of seeing something, of a visual form, are different. So if you go from an experience of a sound to an experience of a visual form, it's different. So you can't be a single one soul. If it changes from being one to being the other, like an actor changing costumes, then, or like an actor in different roles in different movies. You see Scarlett Johansson in like some of her early movies. You see her in later movies. Is it the same actor? Looks sort of like it, but not really, right? So different, it's not a single thing that's changing, because then it has to change. Like Scarlett Johansson in her early movies, like her first movies, she was in her teenagers. Now she's doing movies and I don't know how old she is. Must be in her 50s or something. So changing, right? Changing, not permanent. That's what we're talking about with the Sankhya school. So that's the idea, refuting the idea that there is a permanent conscious self. And that's from the Indian perspective. As I mentioned at the last night, this is different than the Christian. The Christian idea is you have a soul that is created, and then it's eternal after that. But if it's created in the beginning, if it needs the condition of a God to create it at the beginning, then why does it not need conditions to continue later? It could be a continuum that goes on from one after another, but as we'll discuss in a few minutes, that wouldn't be an actual, real, singular, independent self. Okay, so those are the ideas of there being a soul or an Atman or a self that is permanent, singular, and conscious. So then there was another there were two other schools, the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika, but we'll just call them the Vaisheshika for now. They have very similar positions. And what they say is that the soul, there is an Atman, to use the Sanskrit word, or soul, to use the English word. There is a soul, but it is not conscious. Now, in the Vaisheshika philosophy, they break things down into six different phenomena, down into six different categories, and I'm only going to go through three of them that make any difference to us. There are things that are substances. Substances can be either permanent or impermanent. For example, the four elements of earth, water, fire, and air are considered to be permanent or impermanent substances, but you also have substances that are considered to be permanent, and that was the soul is one of them. So the soul is a substance. Now, substances have qualities. For example, when you look at these flowers, right? This flower, let me turn it around so you can see the one that I'm looking at. This flower here is orange, right? So they say that orange is a quality that is related to, inherent to the flower. So you've got the flower, you've got the substance of the flower, and then you've got the quality of orange. Okay, and they're different. Buddhists would dispute them on this, but this is what they say. You've got the substance, and then you've got the quality that inheres in it. So they say it's similar with the soul. The soul is permanent, it's singular, it's clean, it's pure. No, did I say that? No, I'm getting that confused. The soul is singular and permanent. It is a substance. And one of the qualities that a soul can have is consciousness or mind. So that mind is joined to the soul in a relation. Now, they have two types of relation. One is kind of a permanent relation called inherence. Like with fire, there's a substance of fire, and fire is always hot. Heat is inherent to heat, to fire, right? But the color of fire is not always, and sometimes fire is red. Sometimes fire is blue, right? Sometimes fire is clear. So the color has a different type of relation because it's not always there. So that is what they call a conjunction. So here, when you talk about the soul as being related, as the soul, as being kind of occasionally joined to or related to a consciousness, it's a temporary relation called conjunction. If you have studied Aristotelian philosophy, this is what Aristotelian philosophy would call an accidental relation. But that's as far as I'm going to go on that one. I actually don't know much about Aristotelian philosophy, although it seems in some basic levels similar to the Vaisheshika philosophy. At any rate, so you've got the soul, and you've got this. What they're saying is that the soul is occasionally joined with mind and occasionally not. When you are conscious of something, it's joined with mind, and when it's not conscious of something, for example, when you're in deep sleep, when you have been, if you fall into a coma or you get knocked out or something, or in any other state where there's no consciousness, then there's no mind, and it is not joined to the mind at that point, right? Is that clear? Okay, because when you understand the positions, it makes it much easier. And fortunately, the Vaisheshika position is easier to summarize than the Samkhya position. All right, so now that we've got that, we've got a soul, you've got consciousness that comes and goes. They're related in a way that's called conjunction. So in that way, you can say that the soul is not conscious, but it still knows, they say. Well, so what does Shantideva say about that? He says, nor can what is non-sentient be the self, because it has no mind like jugs and such. But if it knows from being conjoined with mind, it follows the non-sentient perishes. So you've got this permanent non-sentient mind, right? Or this non-sentient self. If it is not sentient, it cannot be the self, because we can tell from our experience that we know things, right? It's just part of your nature as being a sentient being that you know things, right? So therefore, something non-sentient, this idea of what they call a self, the Atman in the Vaisheshika school, cannot actually be a self. And why not? Because it's like a mind. And the analogy for this is it's like a jug. Or we could say, like, since I don't have a jug, well, this is actually probably pretty close to a jug because it's got the right size and shape and it holds water. And a narrow neck, round belly, and it holds water. This is therefore a jug, right? Okay, but we would usually call this a vase. At any rate, if you say this vase is, it could also therefore be conjoined with mind. It's exactly the same. The soul is exactly the same in this in being non-sentient. So if this non-sentient soul can know from being conjoined with mind, why couldn't this? There's no difference. This is the argument that Shantideva makes. And what the Vaisheshika reply is that, well, because there's a conjunction, because the mind can be temporarily related to the self, therefore to the soul, therefore the soul can know because it's got this temporary conjunction, and then that goes. But Shantideva's reply is that if that is the case, then there are times when the non-sentient self, that is what it said, that follows the non-sentient, that is the self, perishes. That means it stops being non-sentient. It becomes sentient. When it's conjoined with mind, it becomes sentient, and then not. So it's changing. If it's changing based on the causes and conditions of whether or not it is conjoined with mind or not, it cannot be permanent, cannot be singular, right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so we're going to move on. I don't want to belabor this too much. Then the Vaisheshika replies that even though it can be conjoined with mind, it can be related to mind temporarily, it still is unchangeable itself. And Shantideva says, if there is no change in the self, what does cognition do for it? So if the self is not affected by being conjoined with mind, then cognition couldn't do anything. In fact, the self would not be able to know anything. So it would be inert. In this way, you have made unknowing and inert space into the self. There's no difference between space, which is another substance that the Vaisheshika philosophy says is a substance like the soul. They're both permanent unknowing. So space is like ether. We could say ether. With the sort of the 19th century ideas of ether in Western philosophy, like the stuff that is space. It's not knowing, it's inert. The soul is said to be the same thing. So what they're doing is they're basically saying there's something that is exactly the same as space as the soul. There's no way it could actually know or be a self or do anything. So that is the refutation of the Vaisheshika philosophy on these points. So after this, we now get to the next point, which is actually, it is sort of part of the Vaisheshika position, but it's also a position that we have in other schools, which you have the problem of if there's no self, and yet you say that there's karmic cause and effect, well, you've got one person who's doing the action, and then the result is experienced later. How can you say that they're the same person? So, what do we say? Tashi does something. Tashi slaughters a pig. Okay, that's a bad action, right? So it's killing. So it's a bad action. So later on, Tashi, in a future lifetime, experiences the result of killing the pig. Karmic result. So there has to be something that connects the Tashi who killed with the Tashi who experiences the result, which might be being reborn in the hell realm, or being reborn as a pig and being slaughtered yourself, or whatever. That's right. There's got to be someone who's, otherwise, how can you say that karmic cause and effect works? Because what we say is that when you come and you make offerings to the shrine, you put out water and flowers and such, that this is a virtuous act. In the future, you're going to have a virtuous result. When you do something bad, when you slaughter pigs or whatever you're going to do, when you tell lies or commit sexual misconduct or whatever, in the future, you're going to have a bad act, a bad result of that. So if there's no self, how can we say that there is, then how can karmic cause and effect work? So this is actually a problem that an issue that comes up with any of the Buddhist presentations, because in all the Buddhist schools, we say, except for one, we say that there's no true self. So how does it work? So first, to present the objection, with no self, the relationship of act and result would make no sense. One perishes when the act is done. So whose act would it be, you say? So back to our example of Tashi slaughtering the pig. Tashi, who slaughters the pig, is impermanent, according to the Buddhists. So the moment after slaughtering the pig, it's actually a new being that seems similar to Tashi, but it's actually a different one. And in every moment, it's a new person, a new being. And then on into the future lifetime, where it's still a different, where it's a different being that experiences the result. So Tashi slaughters the pig in one lifetime. In another lifetime, he is reborn as a pig and then is slaughtered. In that future lifetimes, it's a completely different being. How can you say that karma cause and effect? So whose act is it? Who experiences the result? And so here, this is presented particularly as an objection from the Vaisheshika school, who also say that there's karmic cause and effect, but they say that there's a soul. So Shantideva's reply is in particular to the Vaisheshika school. He says, it's proven to us both the bases of act and result are separate, and that the self does not act on them. Is this not pointless to debate? So what he's saying here is that the bases of the act and the result, what he means here are the 5 aggregates, the body and the mind at the time of the act, and the body and the mind at the time of experiencing the result are different. If you say that there's a permanent soul, and that all the aggregates and everything else are like going, coming and going around it, as the Vaisheshika do, and also to a lesser extent the Sankhya, but mostly to the Vaisheshika, then what experiences the result later is the body and mind. The soul, being permanent and unchanging, is not affected because it's immutable. So it's not affected. And the soul does not act upon the aggregates. The aggregates do not act upon the soul. The soul does not act on the aggregates or is not acted upon because it's permanent. It cannot act. Because if it acted, it would change. So basically, whether or not you say there's a permanent self, it's actually the same. So here we're going to have you might have the doubt, well, how do we explain this in Buddhism? In Buddhism, it's talked about as being the continuum of the aggregates. It's like a river. For example, we have the Androscoggin River, right? So I have to use the local thing. You have the Androscoggin River. It's not totally local, of course. It's a little bit north of here. So that starts way up in some lake in northern Maine, and it flows down, and eventually it reaches the Atlantic Ocean, right? Is it the same river? I mean, you've got the water that flows through the water at any given point. The water that flows through it is changing. And if you sort of like follow the water of the river from up in the headwaters all the way down to where it goes in the sea, the water is constantly changing. It's mixing with water from different rivers and so forth. We call it all by the same name. We call it all the Androscoggin, from up whatever that lake is called down to the, I had to look at, I did my research. I looked at Apple Maps the other day. So I remembered the Androscoggin River, but I couldn't remember where. So I followed it up to its headwaters, and there is a lake that it comes from. And it flows down to the sea. We give it the same name, say it's the same river. But it's not really the same, is it? What you do at the beginning of the Androscoggin River makes an effect at the bottom. If you have a paper mill that pollutes the Androscoggin River up in the north or inland, you're going to have a polluted river at the base, right? If you clean up that paper mill, you put in good filters or whatever, and then the water will be cleaner downstream, right? So what you do up at the headwaters affects what happens at the base. It's the same with ourself. We have like this continuum of our minds and our bodies, and they're constantly changing, and we exchange bodies from time to time, like after every lifetime, right? Actually, we're exchanging bodies in every single instant because our bodies are actually all the electrons and everything, kind of combining and recombining, falling apart, the particles coming into being, going out of being. But we look at it, it seems like it's all the same body from the time that you are born until you're later. But if you go back and look at your pictures, as we did a little bit at breakfast, if you look at your pictures of what you were when you were a kid, what you were as a teenager, what you were as a young adult, and then for many of us, what you do is you're getting to be an older adult, and then when you get to be an adult of a certain age, it changes, right? The body's constantly changing. Our mind is constantly changing. So it's the continuum of the 5 aggregates that is the basis for us to project the ideas of me that goes from one lifetime to the next, and experience is the result. So there are 2 important points here. The first point is that when you do something that is going to have a bad karmic result, that means in a sense, it's going to be experienced by a later being in your same continuum. It's not going to be you as you think of yourself. It's going to be a later being. But still, there's going to be the experience of suffering. The other point is that if you go back the other way, if we look at, and this is kind of a digression, I'm sorry, but I have to digress a little bit. If you go back the other way, you look at if you think about karma, cause, and effect, saying that it's because of all of the incredible good karma that we've done that we have been born in this particular lifetime, in this particular body. Excuse me, I'm going to take out this that's bothering me. Put it someplace else. We have all this we have incredible good karma to be born as humans at a time when the Dharma has spread, to be able to come into contact, to be in a time when we're in a prosperous society, and generally have our needs met to some degree. We also experience sufferings in our lifetime. Those are the results of and if you look at it in one level, to a large extent, the result of where we are born, to the parents that we're born into. That comes, according to our Buddhist teachings, because of your karma. This happens because of something else that happened in the past. And it affected you now, or it affects you now. So this is, when we say that someone has done, that your experience in life, for example, if you get sick, and it is the result of karma, not the result of an action in this lifetime. For example, if you get lung cancer because you smoke, that's not the result of bad karma from a past life. That's the result of smoking. If you get cancer because you happen to be born in a particular place and time where you're exposed to chemicals that cause cancer, that's a result of karma. And so if you have that type of cancer, it happens because of actions of a previous being in your lifetime. You could say an action that I have done in a previous lifetime, but it wasn't really you. So that means you can't really take it too personally. You can't say, oh, I messed up. It's not a cause it's not a reason to be down on yourself or to be upset at yourself. It's just how things happen. You were born in that particular situation. It's done. You can look and see what you, that is the previous being in your continuum, did, and see what I did that caused this must have been bad. So I'm going to avoid doing bad things in the future, so that the me of the future, which is sort of a different being who happens to be in the same continuum, experiences it. So this is how it is. There's a continuum of cause and result. And so if we want the being in the future not to experience the suffering, we need to make sure we have good action now. It's all about the continuum. It's not that there is a single self that is the same from lifetime after lifetime. It's changing. Okay. Well, let's go back to the text. So the next stanza reads, it cannot possibly be seen that the one with the cause would have the result, because it's a different continuum. The actor and the reaper are taught based on a single continuum. So when we say that there's a person who acts and that makes the seed to reap or experience a future result, it's based on a single continuum, as I was just explaining. So the fact that I was born in the particular place that I was born was due to a previous being in my continuum doing certain things that led me to be born in a particular family, in a particular place, in a particular society, in a particular social position that gave me the situation I'm in. And it's the same for all of us, right? They're based on a single continuum, but it's not like you can say it's a single person. Okay, so that's the issue of karmic cause and result. Now you might say, well, that continuum of the self is a single thing. Like you've got the, I'll use myself as an example. You've got the Khenpo David in the first instant, the second instant, and so forth, up till now. I don't know how many instants it's been since I've been born. Quite a few. So in each instant, there's a new Khenpo David. But you could say that that continuum of Khenpo David is a real being. That is the self. And so Shantideva's reply to this is that, and this is the position of a non-Buddhist school called the Mimamsaka school. So they say that the continuum of the past, present, and future mind is the self. Shantideva's reply is, the past and future minds are not a me, since they do not exist. If the arisen mind is me, when it is gone, the me is no longer. The past minds mean all the minds of the past. They can't be part of a continuum because they no longer exist. When something arises and it ceases, then it no longer exists. Likewise, the future moments in my continuum do not exist because they have not arisen yet. And you have no idea how they're going to be. They could turn out in any different number of ways. There's no certainty about how they could be. They do not exist, right? So you can't say that they're me. And then if you say that the present moment of mind, that is a me, well, the present moment of my mind is changing every single instant. So therefore, it can't be a me either, right? So if you look at it, therefore, you cannot say that the continuum, which is just the past, present, and future minds all put together and labeled as a me, it cannot be a real me either, because it's not real. It's like an idea that we have that we're projecting onto past, future, and present. But it's like you can't even really project anything onto the past because it's not there. You can't projecting onto the future, it's not there. The only thing you could project onto is the present, and it can't be permanent because it's always changing. Then we get to the position of the Vatsiputriya school. And what they say, they are a Buddhist school. They are the one Buddhist school that said that there is a self. They said that there is a self that is not different than the five aggregates, and it's not the same as the five aggregates. It's ineffable. There's an ineffable self that is neither the same nor different from the five aggregates. That's what the Vatsiputriya school says. And this is probably similar. You might think, well, there must be some sort of self that we can't describe. That's just somehow like some sort of soul. There must be a soul that we that exists, but we're just unable to describe it. So Shantideva says, just as when one dissects the trunk of a banana tree, there's nothing. When scrutinized analytically, the me as well is nothing true. So here, and this is kind of a hard analogy for us here in Maine, because there are no banana trees in Maine. I mean, maybe in some tropical greenhouse, are there any? You might know better. But even if there is a banana tree in the tropical greenhouse, they're not going to let you dissect the trunk. So you have to go to some tropical country to find a banana tree, or you can read about them on Wikipedia. So a banana tree, it looks like it's got a trunk, and then there are all these fronds on the top, and then there are purple flowers that grow bananas, right? That's the banana tree. And so if you look at the trunk, it looks like a tree trunk. But actually the tree trunk, what it's made up of is the stems of all of the leaves that kind of stick out at the top. All of those leaves the stems of those wrap around each other, and on the outside it gets kind of brown and scaly, kind of like but it's not really, I guess it gets a bit of a bark on the outside, but it's not like the same as a tree trunk. You've got a tree trunk, like a good piece of ash or a good maple tree. You've got a trunk of tree that's solid. You can say this is real, and you can use it, you can make something out of it. With a banana trunk, it's like if you take it apart, you take off the outside leaf looking for the trunk, then there's just another leaf. You take that off, you take that off, you take each one off till you get to the middle and there's nothing left. Not like a maple tree where you can cut off all the limbs and you've still got a tree trunk, right? So when scrutinized analytically, you can't find anything that really is the trunk of a banana tree. Similarly, when you look at a self, you can't find anything else. If there is a self, then it would be something that we know because it's ourselves, right? Where is it? So it can't actually exist. So there's nothing that we can find that could be a self that is other than our body and our mind. Our body and mind are not a self. So in this way, we would say that there's no self. A self is just a fiction. It's an idea we project onto the body and mind. So this is the description of the selflessness of the individual. But there's a problem. If you don't have an individual, then if there are no individuals, then how can we have compassion? And this Shantideva replies to this saying, so that the objection is basically, if beings are not real, why bother having compassion? If sentient beings do not exist, for whom should one arouse compassion? Right? If everyone's selfless, why bother having compassion? Because there's no one to have compassion for. And Shantideva's reply is, for those projected by delusion, whom we accept for sake of results. So people they project the idea of a self. They project the idea of their own self. They project by the idea of other people. And people experience suffering. Even if that suffering is not true, even if the being experiencing the suffering is not real, there is the illusory experience of suffering that they do not recognize as being illusory. Because they don't recognize it as illusory, they are deluded. And also, when we say that there's another sentient being, we're also deluded. But in order to be able to meditate on compassion, because if we're going to achieve Buddhahood, we have to have compassion. We have to have loving kindness, as I spoke about the other night. Without these, you can't get to Buddhahood. And the nature of our Buddha nature is basically the full development of loving kindness and compassion that is empty, the union of emptiness and compassion. So in order to achieve the result of Buddhahood, we say, even if they're not real, we're still going to meditate on compassion for sentient beings. So that's why we do it, for the sake of the result. This is like when we say we're accepting it, it's like you're taking it as a basis for your object. You know that it's not real. It's like when we talk about in the Tonglen meditation, when we do the Tonglen teachings, when Rinpoche taught Tonglen, he always talked about the saying of Serlingpa or Suvarnadvipa. His actual name is Dharmakirti. He said that if you're meditating on compassion, you have to have some good ground to grow. It's like manure. Manure is filth. You don't want filth, but if you want to grow flowers, if you want to grow a crop, you need manure in order to have a good fertile field. In the same way, the idea of a self is it's made up, it's an obscuration. It's in that sense, it is similar to the manure in being filthy, something that we want to eliminate. But in order to grow the good crop of Buddhahood and the results, we have to meditate as if there were selves, use that manure as sort of fuel for our meditation. So Shantideva is essentially saying the same thing here. Then the question is, well, who's going to achieve the result if there are no sentient beings? Whose is the fruit if there are no beings? In other words, who's going to achieve Buddhahood? If there's no being to achieve Buddhahood, whose result is it? And Shantideva's reply is, that's true. The wish is from delusion. In other words, wishing to achieve the result of Buddhahood is deluded. But we practice it for the sake of quelling suffering. Don't block delusion about the result. So the idea of there being Buddhahood to achieve is a delusion. But if we want to actually free ourselves from the suffering, we have to use that delusion in order to get beyond delusion, right? So you use your confusion in order to transcend confusion, because we have no other way of doing it. So you have to have that idea of other sentient beings. Even if you recognize that they're illusory and not real, you still have to develop compassion for them. We still want to achieve Buddhahood, even though we realize that Buddhahood, our idea of Buddhahood is deluded. We don't have any idea what deluded is, what Buddhahood really is. Okay, so moving on a little bit. So delusions of a self increase the cause of suffering the ego. So there are some delusions that are useful and some that are not. When you have the delusion of having compassion for other sentient beings, this is useful. It helps you. When you have the delusion that you can achieve Buddhahood, this is useful. When you have the delusion of a me that really exists, this is not useful. That is the cause of suffering. That ego is a cause of suffering. So we need to decrease our delusion of there being an ego, but still work with the illusion of there being a result to achieve, of there being compassion to meditate on. So this is why we work on it. Now, the response is that they say is, there's no stopping that, you say. So the opponent, this is either the Vaisheshika or the Samkhya or whoever it is, the person who doesn't believe, who says, you can't get rid of the idea of the ego. It's too deep in there. You can't get rid of the idea of there being a self or an ego. And Shantideva's reply is, to cultivate selflessness is supreme. So if we can overcome the idea of there being an ego, and the way to do this is by meditating on the selflessness of an individual and the selflessness of phenomena. Okay. So this, I think, if I'm correct, this completes the section on the selflessness of the individual. And so now we've come to the section on the selflessness of phenomena. One moment, please. So when we're talking about the selflessness of the individual, what we're saying is that the idea of a me, a single, permanent, enduring, and autonomous soul or me, is an idea that we project onto our bodies and minds. It's just an idea, it's a projection. It's not something that's actually there. That's talking about the individual. Now, if you take the same logic and you apply it to anything else, you can see that that also lacks anything that is singular, eternal, enduring, autonomous either, right? So to go back to my example of the bouquet of flowers, there's nothing that is single or enduring or autonomous about these flowers. Of course, it's easy to see this with a bouquet because these flowers, even no matter how many times we replenish the water, the flowers will drop their petals and it'll wilt and it will look terrible in 3 or 4 days, right? Then we'll throw it out. That's easy to see, but also with things like this glass jug or vase, whatever you want to call it. Well, I'm in America, I can say vase, right? So this jug or vase also is impermanent. We know that it's impermanent because I can move it, right? If it were permanent, it couldn't be moved. It couldn't be the recipient of any action because it would change. The location changes relative to other things. We know it's impermanent because if I throw it onto the floor, it's going to break, but I'm not going to throw it onto the floor because it's a nice little jug, nice little vase, right? So it's the same thing. It's the same logic. So there's really, in a sense, if you look at it, the selflessness of an individual is kind of like a subset of the selflessness of all phenomena. The logic is the same. But there's a difference is that it's easier to kind of see that you don't have any real self because it's part of your experience. You can just look at yourself, you can see this. So realizing the selflessness of the individual is a little bit easier. And it helps us overcome all of our afflictions, all of our greed, hatred, desire, greed, hatred, delusions, pride, envy, wrong views, and so forth. We can completely uproot those by meditating on the selflessness of the individual, but it's not enough to completely free ourselves from the obscurations of misunderstanding the full nature of things, the emptiness of all phenomena that we need to eliminate in order to achieve Buddhahood. So we also need to meditate on the selflessness of phenomena, which is another word for emptiness. The basic way that you're looking at phenomena is essentially the same. The difference is, what are you looking at? Are you looking at your own mind and body, or are you looking at other things? But the logic is essentially the same. This is a point that Mipam Rinpoche makes in his commentary on this chapter. So when we talk about it, so this is the second section of the meditation on emptiness. The second is meditating on the selflessness of phenomena. And Shantideva discusses this by talking about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Now, you might have heard about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. If you've done any reading about Buddhism, you've probably come across these terms. It's especially common in the Theravada tradition. They do these practices, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, quite a bit, but it is also discussed in the Mahayana tradition as well, and in the Tibetan tradition. So the 4 foundations of mindfulness are mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of dharmas. So these are the 4 foundations: body, feelings, mind, and dharmas. So body means physical body, but not just in the Theravada tradition. They primarily meditate on the mind, on the mindfulness of one's own body, but you can also meditate on others' bodies or other physical things. Okay, mindfulness of feelings. When we're talking about feelings, feelings are the sensations that occur when you have the contact of the senses with an object. The eye sees a form, and it may be either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. There are these 3: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The ear hears a sound, such as an airplane flying overhead, right? There's contact of the ear with the object. And from that contact, there is a sound of it being either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Similarly with your nose, you smell a scent, and it's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And likewise with the body. And with our mind also, we have the mental feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So you've got 3 or 5 feelings, you could say. There's physically pleasant, mentally pleasant, these 2. You've got physically unpleasant, mentally unpleasant. Then you've got the neutral feelings, which are hard to distinguish between mental and physical. So we can talk about it as either being 5 sorts of feelings: physically pleasant, physically pleasant, mentally pleasant, physically unpleasant, and neutral. Or you can put it in 3: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Doesn't really matter. What we're not talking about when we say feelings are emotions, right? We're not talking about emotions. We're talking about sensations of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral that arise from contact with an object. Either the sensory consciousness contacting an object and experiencing it as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, or when you have a thought about some object and experience that thought, experience a feeling of pleasure, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral with it. Okay. Mindfulness of mind then is all the thoughts you have about that. Then with dharmas, what we are talking about are all of our projections onto all that, all of the ideas that we have about everything. So basically all phenomena, right? So those are the 4 categories of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. We go through each of them in turn. Even though they're called the foundations of mindfulness in English, actually the nature of these is prajna. Why are they prajna? It's because you're examining the body. You're examining feelings, you're examining mind, and you're examining dharmas, and you're coming to a greater understanding of saying, oh, this is what it is, this is what it's not. And so in this way, it is prajna. It's called the foundation of mindfulness because you have to have mindfulness and awareness to be able to continue the analysis. If you are practicing the mindfulness of the body, and then you're thinking about, oh, I've got to do this tomorrow and that tomorrow, go back to the mindfulness, blah, 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 blah. You don't have any mindfulness, you aren't going to get anywhere in your analysis, in your examination. So you have to have the mindfulness that keeps the mind steady while you're doing that. They're a meditative practice, a type of, in the Theravada tradition, they're considered insight meditation, right? They're meditation that lead us to a greater understanding of the body, of what we are, what we're experiencing. So in the Theravada tradition, they primarily do this meditation just for your own body and mind, because by doing this, you can free yourself from samsara, free yourself from suffering. In the Mahayana, it's like everyone. You can do it for everyone. So it's a much broader focus. Instead of just looking at your own body, it's looking at everything physical. But you start with your own body, of course, but all the beings, the bodies of other beings as well. When talking about feelings, it's not just your own feelings, but all the feelings that there are, and the objects of the feelings. And then the mind and Dharma is a similarly much larger scope. Okay. So when you talk about the first of these is mindfulness of body, and there are two parts. And the first is the idea that individual body parts are not the body. And the second aspect of this is refuting that there is a separate whole body. Okay. So first we're going to go through the refuting that individual body parts are the body. So this is actually kind of similar to what we went through last night. The body is not the feet or calves, nor are the thighs or hips the body. It's not the belly or the back, neither is it the chest or arms. It's not the ribs, hands, armpits, shoulders, and it is not the organs either. The head and throat are not the body, so what then is the body here? So here is similar to the teeth and hair, the teeth and hair and nails aren't me. It's very similar. But here, instead of saying, is it a me? We've already determined that there's not a me, but you might think, even though there's not a me, my body's real. I can touch it, right? I can knock my head. It's real. If I didn't have a real body, I couldn't do this. When I walk outside, to use what was it? Who was it who refuted? You can stub your toe. There was Berkeley, the idealist philosopher, someone that was refuting him. What was it? And stubbed his toe, said, see, therefore I'm not just that, because he could stub his toe. You feel like there's got to be a body. I'm sorry, that was a real digression. You're all looking at me like, okay. We won't talk about Charles Berkeley and idealist philosophy today. We will talk about Madhyamaka philosophy. So you have the idea that there's really a body. So what is your body? So it's not, are your feet the body? No, the calves, you can go through each part of the body. And here you're basically going from bottom to top, starting with the feet, calves, thighs, hips, belly, back, chest or arms, ribs, armpits, shoulders, the throat and head. None of these individual parts are the body. So what is the body? The reason why he's asking this is because what he's saying is that the body is basically, you take all the different parts of the body and you ascribe a name to it. You call it by the name body. You project the idea of body onto the individual parts. Similar to the idea of projecting the idea of me onto your body and mind. So then there's the idea, well, the individual parts are not the body, but there is a real whole thing that is the body, right? There's something that is the body. The hand's not the body, but the hand is a part of the body, and that body that it is a part of is real. So this is the logic of whether the whole and parts. Is there a whole that exists separately from its parts? So first, so when you look at this, you have to look at it. Well, what is the relationship of this real body to the parts? Is it like that each part of the body is the body? Is that how it is? And so to address this, Shantideva says, now if the body were to dwell partially in all of them, its parts would thus dwell in those parts, but where would it reside itself? So, okay, so if the body dwells in the parts, for example, you've got the body is in the hand. Is the whole body in the hand? Well, in that case, there'd be a whole body here. It would be, or excuse me, no, is the whole body in the hand, or is it part of the body in the hand? So he first talks about whether it's part of the body in the hand. So there's a part of the body in this hand. There's a part of the body in this hand. There's a part of the body in these two elbows. There's a part of body in the head. There's a part of body in the throat and the chest and the feet and sides. So there's a part in each of them. But where is the body itself? The parts of the body are in your hands and so forth, but where is the body itself? You can't find it. I'm giving you the answer. Actually, you really should just examine this yourself. It's one thing to read this and sort of think about it. It's another thing to actually sit down and look and think, because it's easy to sort of take this on face value. You really have to examine it for yourself. But in interest of time, if I'm going to finish the chapter by tomorrow, I have to move along. Now, the other option is that the whole body resides in each of the parts. So my right hand there's a whole body in my right hand. There's a whole body in my left hand. There's a whole body in my nose. There's a whole body in each of my ears. And in all my different body parts, there's a whole body. But that would mean that I'd have there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so how many body parts do you have? Even if you go into smaller and smaller pieces, every cell of your body, every part of every cell, and every atom that made a part of the body would therefore have a whole body in it. And so my one body would be therefore billions of bodies. That doesn't make sense. There would be as many bodies as there are hands, etc. If there's no body outside or in, how's there a body and hands or such? If it's not separate from the hands and such, how does it exist? So if there's no body, if you can't find a body, when you look inside the body, you can't find a body. When you look outside of the body, can you find a body? I mean, is like my body over there someplace? No, my body would be here. So it's not outside my body. When you look inside the body, you can't find it. Then how does it exist in the hands and such? And if it's not separate from the hands and such, then how does it exist? When you examine it logically, then there's no way you can find a truly existing body as a single thing. In other words, it's like the me. It's an idea that we project onto the assemblage of parts. Well, then when you start looking at the part, then it's kind of the analogy for this is it's like seeing a scarecrow and mistaking it for a person. Thus, there's no body. From delusion, we think of hands and such as a body, just like perceiving a scarecrow as a human from its specific shape. So normally you wouldn't mistake a scarecrow for a person, right? But if it were kind of dark and you're walking along and there's no electric light because it's the 7th century, and you see a scarecrow in the dark of late evening, you might think it's a person at first from the shape. It might make you think that there's a shape. So you've got the conditions. You've got the scarecrow. You've got the darkness. You've got you and looking. Because of these conditions, you see it as a scarecrow. In the same way, because of conditions, we look at our body, the hands and feet and so forth, and when they're all put together, this body appears as human. So while the conditions are assembled, the body will appear as human. Likewise, as long as there are hands and such, they'll seem to be a body. So as long as you have, all the conditions that you need to appear as a human body, the hands and other body parts, enough body parts. I mean, of course, we still perceive people who are missing hands and legs and such as being humans. But when you have enough body parts put together, it's kind of recognizably human. Then we'll say that's a human body, right? So it's because of the causes and conditions that we make the idea. It looks like there is a body, but there isn't actually anything that we could say is a body. Just like when you look at a scarecrow, there's not really a person there, but it looks as if there were. So then there's the problem of, we could say, well, okay, the body doesn't exist, but the hand does. So in the same way, what are the hands, which are assemblages of fingers? You've got 5 fingers plus a palm. You've got a front and back. And those are assemblages of knuckles, dissecting the knuckles into their parts, the parts to divide into atoms, dividing the atoms into sides. Those two can split and have like space, no parts, so there are no atoms either. So some of you might remember Tangpa Rinpoche, he often used this example of your hand. This is a hand, right? You can use it and do things with your hand. You can pick up vases of flowers and you can hold vases of flowers. So it is useful. It works, right? It's a hand, right? Is this really a hand? So the question is what is the hand? Is this the hand? I mean, is this the hand? No, it's the thumb. What is this? It's the index finger. What about that? Each of these fingers, are the fingers the hand? No. Well, you might say, well, the fingers, the hand is just an idea. You have the fingers in the palm and so forth. You have the idea of that as hand, but the fingers exist. Well, it's the same with the fingers, because your finger, you've got 3 joints, you've got the 3 knuckles, different parts. You've got skin, you've got bones, you've got muscle and blood vessels. Not a whole lot of muscle in these fingers. All I do with them is type on the computer, right? So not a whole lot of muscle, but there are blood vessels and gore and yucky stuff inside and tendons, whatever. And you divide it far enough down, then you go from cells into the mitochondria and whatever, and that down into the DNA and proteins and so forth, molecules, until you get down to the atoms. Now, in the 7th century, actually until very recently, they didn't have an idea of the subatomic structures that we do now. So their idea is that if there's going to be, that you get down to atoms, and the atoms are really tiny and they're indivisible. And their idea is that you put enough atoms together that then each of the atoms has no parts, it's partless, but you put them all together and then you get a body. This is the idea of many Indian schools. But if you put 2 atoms together, for example, if my left fist and my right fist were each atoms, and they touch each other, then you've automatically got 2 parts. You've got the part that's touching and the part that's not. So this partless atom would have to have 2 parts. If they were to contact each other without touching, then they'd have to kind of merge into one, completely penetrate one another, so that they're completely touching each other. Because if they're only partially touching each other, then they have parts. So if they were actually real single things that could contact, they'd have to contact totally, which would mean that everything would just collapse down into the size of a single atom if there was any contact. So in this way, the atoms they split down into further and further parts, and you can't even find the parts because the parts would contact the part of the atom that is contacting the atom, and the part that's not contacting the other atom would be contacting each other, and then you can't find them either. So there's nothing that you can find. So physically, there's nothing that you can find. So the atoms do not really exist. So the smaller and smaller you go, you still cannot find anything that truly exists. So in this way, what discerning person would lust for such a dream-like form? When in this way there is no body, what is a man? What is a woman? So normally we have the idea of a body, and we see some bodies as attractive and others as less attractive, some as not attractive. And so we feel lust for a particular type of body. For example, if you feel lust for male bodies, you will see a beautiful example of a male body and you will feel lust. Well, what are you feeling lust for? When you understand fully that there's no body there, what are you feeling your desire for? What are you feeling aversion for when you see a body that is not attractive? What is a man? What is a woman? I mean, if there's no body, there's no basis to project any ideas of gender. And so what can there be? It's all just an idea. What time are we at? 11:18. Mindfulness of feelings. I think mindfulness of feelings is a good topic to start with this afternoon. I don't want to overdo it right now. But let's just to go over a review. A brief review. We've spoken about the idea of the mindfulness of self, or excuse me, the selflessness of individuals, that there is no real being, that the idea of there being a me or a soul or a person is just an idea that we project onto the bodies and the minds. So that's the selflessness of the individual. Now, when we go through the selflessness of phenomena, we're going through, basically, we're looking at the bases of what we project upon as being a self. So the body, the feelings, the mind, and the Dharma, the different projections that we have, to see whether any of them actually have any basis. So these are the two levels. So the mindfulness, or the selflessness of the individual is like a subset of the other, but it's one that we treat separately because it's a little bit easier to realize. So that is where we are right now. And I'm wondering, we've had quite a bit last night and tonight, this morning. And of course, it always takes a while to come up with questions. So have you all come up with any questions, either online or individually? And if you are online and you have a question, you need to let me know something. You can either do the Zoom hand waving thing or hands up thing, or you can just wave your hand in this, and I'll hopefully see. Or if you, okay, yes, you have a question.
Okay, so what I'm wondering about is the mind stream. This continuum, from how I understand it, that our mind stream is this continuum. I remember when you taught on a couple of years ago on the different schools, and we talked about to be like the film, the pieces of the film that.
Yes.
Right. So what I'm wondering is this mind stream another concept that we have, so that when we reach Buddhahood, I'm wondering what happens to the mind stream. Is it just a concept, and then when we reach Buddhahood, we shed that because it's just a concept?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is a very good question. The question is, for all of you on Zoom who may not have heard, the question is about the continuum of mind, or the mind stream. What basically is the continuum of mind? So it continues from moment to moment. When we get to the level of Buddhahood, then what happens to this mind stream? Is that right? Yeah. What happens to the mind stream when we get to the level of Buddhahood? So the mind stream is the continuum, one moment after another moment of our regular cognitions, right? Are the things we see, the things we hear, the things that we think in our mind or our emotions and so forth. These are all part of our mind stream. And they all come up because of ignorance. And so, and in particular, they come up through the ignorance of mistaking there for being like an actual mind or something that's perceiving, and there being something that is perceived. The apprehender and the apprehended. We have a mind, an actual apprehender that will apprehend an external object, right? So that is an ignorance, because it's mistaking the fundamental nature of things. If there is no mind or no perceiver, and then there's nothing to be perceived, if there's nothing to perceive, there can be no perceiver. And so as we go through the path and we gradually overcome these obscurations, these cognitive obscurations, these relative thoughts are gradually cleansed and purified until finally, at the last moment of being a sentient being, when the Vajra-like samadhi that overcomes all the obscurations arises, then we are completely freed from all those obscurations. And so the continuum of mind ceases. What remains is wisdom, the wisdom of a Buddha, which is not based on ignorance. It's not dualistic. It's not something we can conceive of now, because we are so used to conceptually seeing things conceptually and dualistically, that we cannot have any idea what it's like to be a Buddha, what it's like to experience it. But the Buddhas have wisdom that it's empty, it's aware, it knows. The wisdom knows, but there's nothing you can identify it, and they don't grasp at anything. It's unlimited. So there's the wisdom that occurs. So basically, the continuum of the mind ceases at the moment that you achieve Buddhahood. And then at that point, you only have wisdom. The Buddhas do not have any mind. The reason that they don't have any mind is that mind is caused by ignorance. So if there's no ignorance, how can you have a dualistic mind? Okay. Yes.
Who or what is projecting the individual self? Does that have something to do with the mind stream?
It's like it's okay. So who or what is projecting the individual self is the question. So the individual self and all of the ideas of self are kind of just projections that come out of delusion of mistaking the nature of our consciousness. So when we project the idea of an individual self, we have an experience, and so we assume that there must be something experiencing it. And that it's hard to say who actually is experiencing, who actually is doing the projection. Of course, in some level, it's our mind, but it's the fact that the mind is appearing to us in a dualistic way, that we have the idea that there is like this apprehender, perceiver, with the idea that there is something being apprehended or perceived. In actuality, none of them are there. So who is actually having that? It's like we are mistaking, the cognition is occurring and we are mistaking its nature. And as a result of mistaking the nature of the cognition, we are therefore projecting the idea of self and other. And that idea of self then develops into the idea of an individual self. So it's nothing other than our own minds, but because we are ignorant of the nature of our own minds, we conceive of it in this way. Okay.
So when Buddhahood is attained, then the those projections just subside.
So the question, so the follow-up question is, when Buddhahood is attained, then those projections cease. That is correct. In fact, when you achieve the first level of the first Bodhisattva level of the path of seeing, and you see the nature of the Dharmata, at that point, the projections cease when you are in meditation. And that experience of being in meditation is not different from Buddhahood. It's just it's limited because you can only do it in meditation for a limited amount of time. But it's essentially the same thing. Then when the Bodhisattva arises from their meditation, they still experience the dualistic dualistic cognitions that we ordinary people do, except there's one difference. They realize they're not true, and they experience them as being like mirages and illusions. They really see it as being like mirages and illusions, unlike us who can say, oh, it's all mirage and illusion, but we don't really feel it. Right. Okay, we have a question online. Where did it go? They have changed Zoom around and you get all these advertisements now. Okay. When one experiences emptiness, do they lose consciousness as it is defined in the Sankhya school? It's the first question. And the second is, why can't the mental continuum be called consciousness? Okay. So the first question is, the consciousness as it is defined in the Sankhya school, I'm not I would have to actually, to really answer this well, I'd have to go back and look at the materials on the Sankhya school, which I'd have to go back and do a bit of research to really say it is. But I think that the consciousness is defined in the Sankhya school as there being the Purusha, the being. We would say that when you experience emptiness, you're just experiencing that there's never really been a Purusha. There's never really been a conscious self. There's never been a consciousness. You are aware of it, you know of it, but it's not conscious. So when you say consciousness in Buddhism, and particularly in our Kaiju school, we're talking about the dualistic apprehension of where you have the feeling that there is something perceiving something else. So that's that. I hope that's a clear enough answer to the first question. I'd have to look at it in more detail. When we don't accept that there is a Purusha, conscious self, as in the Sankhya school. And the second question is, why can't the mental continuum be called consciousness? So here, this is a good question. And as Shantideva briefly explained it, it's saying, well, you can't call the past the self. You can't mind the self. You can't call the future a self. The reason is you can't call those the self is because they don't exist. You might as well call rabbit horns or turtle fur turtle fur. Well, there is a turtle fur brand, but turtles don't have fur. They cannot be called consciousness because they don't exist. You might as well call a space flower, a self. The present one cannot be called a self because it can't be called the present one. You can call the present one consciousness. Actually, I'm misreading the question I'm seeing. Why can't the mental continuum be called consciousness? The mental continuum cannot be called consciousness because the mental continuum is impermanent. It is an idea that we project onto the past, present, and future. The past and future don't exist. The current one, the current one perishes in every instant. So there's always a new one in every instant. So when we're speaking about consciousness in Buddhism, what we're speaking about are those instants of awareness, of dualistic awareness that happen one moment after another. And so the continuum of those, you could call it the continuum of consciousness, but we're talking about a consciousness. In Buddhism in particular, we're talking about each individual instant of consciousness. I hope that is a clearer answer. All right, any other questions? Oh, Susan, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Khenpo.
Let me I have to turn off my microphone and turn up my volume first. I'm going to mute, and I'm going to turn up my volume.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry if my question is not very clear. I don't know what I want to ask, but although we know there's no self, and the self is not permanent, it's constant changing. So my question is, are the changes happens in a certain way, a foreseeable certain way, which is driven by karma and the forms of ourselves in this life? Because we always talk about the old habit, and this habit comes from the memories of the continuous karmas and the experiences we have in this life, which is also the result of the past lives, past karmas. So from this point of view, is the impermanence we are talking here is a foreseeable change related to this self being. Say, my river of karma is different from your rivers of karma and memories and past lives. Now it comes back to this self, this being, because this change is all driven by the continuous karma, continuous actions, continuous of this being's experiences. Then there is this separate individual thing. Sorry, I'm confused. Yeah, that's my question. I'm not sure if it's clear.
Well, I will try to rephrase your question, and we'll see how clear it was. If I'm not rephrasing it properly, let me know. So the question is basically, when you have the karma, when you have the continuum of an individual being, there's a sort of a somewhat predictable, somewhat foreseeable continuum that happens, largely because of your own karma from the past, your habitual ways of thinking, your habitual ways of action. This creates like a sort of defined, foreseeable future for that particular continuum. So is it, let's see, and this is where I'm getting on what the actual question is. It seems to me that you're asking, is this like how you define the individual? Is that correct?
Yeah, because we talk, there's no self. But in this way, there is this foreseeable changing impermanence. It's related to this self being. Right? So there is a self.
Okay. So basically, there is a foreseeable way, there's a predictable way of how the karma and our actions lead from one moment to the next. And so in this way, we might be able to say that there is a self. So when we're talking about this, in a sense, what you're talking about is there's the continuum of the self, and that the continuum of the aggregates that we project as being a self. You've got the continuum of the body that goes throughout this lifetime. And because of the various causes and conditions, some of which come up from karma, some of which come up because of our actions in this lifetime, and various things, it moves in a certain way. And associated with it, there are all the things that happen in our mind, which are also related to causes and conditions. And you can look at the causes and conditions, and that gives a certain, what do we say? That gives you a certain, looks like there's a being there. So I think what you're sort of saying is that continuum a self? So each individual's continuum is separate from everyone else's continuum. The continuum of my mind and body is separate from the continuum of others people's mind and bodies. Otherwise, I would be constantly experiencing what everyone else is experiencing. And when the Buddha, the one that they always say in the texts is that then when the Buddha attained enlightenment, if his continuum was the same as all of ours, we would have attained enlightenment too, but we have not yet, right? We are still ordinary beings. So there is the continuum that goes, but it's not an actual single thing, a single self. It's not permanent. It's not enduring. It's one moment leading to the next as a series of cause and conditions. So you've got the physical and mental conditions all working together, influencing each other to make the stream of what we call a being. But if you call that like a self and say it's a single thing that is an enduring, permanent self, it doesn't work. If you say it's a self for the sake of meditating on compassion, for the sake of wanting to achieve Buddhahood, that works. That's fine, right? If you think of it as a self because you're talking with your friends or your people and you need to sound like you're sane, then that works, right? So it's useful, but it is not necessarily, that doesn't mean that there's a real self. That's basically saying that the continuum is not a self. Ultimately, it can function as a self relatively. Okay, and I think we've got a follow-up here, and they've changed Zoom around. Okay, so here's a follow-up question. Who or what determines virtuous and non-virtuous actions? And in the bardo, are our actions weighed out to determine our next or future birth? I hope this question makes sense. This does make sense. It's basically what determines whether something is virtuous or unvirtuous. Is it going to cause a pleasant result in the future? Either a good result in samsara, or is it going to cause a good result, the good result of achieving like the Bodhisattva levels or Buddhahood? That's a virtuous action. If it is going to cause suffering for yourself and others in the future, then it is an unvirtuous action. It's a very pragmatic way of looking at it. It's not like there's some law that was handed down that says thou shalt not. It's instead saying this is what's going to cause you problems. This is what's going to help you. That's what we mean by virtuous and non-virtuous. And in the bardo, of course, these actions that we do then propel us. They create habits in our mind that propel us in different directions after our death. That's a whole big other topic that we haven't got a lot of time to go into right now. Okay, so I think that is maybe enough for this morning. We will reconvene in just under 2 hours at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, which is what? That's 10:30 a.m. for everyone on the West Coast, right? And those of you in the middle, it's somewhere in the middle. The meditation will begin at 1 p.m. So if you'd like to join us for the meditation as well. So we will close this morning I've gone over as usual. So we'll just do the dedication of merit at the end of the session today. Let's do it in both, since we're only doing the one, let's do it both English and Tibetan. We'll do Tibetan first, then English. O sanam de tam che se pa ni tom de ne pe Pamche Geganachi Balatrodai Sibetsole Vajra by this merit may I attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing and free all wanderers from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Thank you. All right, see you all in a couple of hours.
Thank you, Khenpo.